and welcome back to our conversations about Alfred Hitchcock films. And after doing a discussion on The Birds, which was a Daphne Du Maurier story adapted by Alfred Hitchcock in the story, like, we thought, what better thing than do the other one? Some would say the better one, but that might be very controversial in some ways. We're going to talk about Rebecca, and I'm joined not by Rebecca, but by Jane again.
Hi, how are you? It's so nice to see you, Chris.
It's nice. It's nice that you have a name to start off with, right? That we can actually name you and call you something, because as the story in this film goes, this story is about Rebecca, but not about Rebecca. We never see Rebecca. She never makes an appearance at all. But yet the film's called Rebecca. We see her handwriting. We see all her after effects. But we have this story, and I should tell people that we will be going and having a discussion about this book as if people have seen it. So this will be kind of full spoilers, going into themes, the aspects of the storytelling, the filmmaking process, etc., that make the film Rebecca what it is. Whether that's interesting, things that annoy us, or things that we think are interesting, especially in the guise of looking at Rebecca for both of us in very much a rewatch capacity, and shedding new light on the film and seeing things that we didn't see before. So, I mean, this felt to me, Jane, like a film that we could talk about for maybe about 3 hours.
Absolutely. I had more down in my schedule, to be honest. Well, it is it is such a treat to go back to Manderley. Rebecca is one of my favorite stories. I read the book a long time ago, and I actually ended up rereading it. And I don't normally reread books. And so when I found out that Hitchcock had done a film adaptation about it, it quickly became one of my favorite classic films as well. So I am so excited that we get to sit down and we get to talk about it, because there is a lot to the story, Chris.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll give a brief plot overview. As like, I've heard a lot of people describe the book as being very plot driven, right? A very plot driven story rather than a character driven story. But I think the actual plot itself is sort of thin in the top of it. We have a wealthy man, Maxim De Winter, who his first wife has died under circumstances which are to be explored within the book a little bit, but is known to have sort of killed herself. And he meets a young, impressionable young woman who is unnamed. We'll just call her narrator. And he weds her, essentially. Once they move to a big rich house, they are confronted by the existence or sort of the place that his wife, while dead, still has a very prominent hold on the house, and also the people that work there. And it's how she fits into the household while exploring the events of actually what happened, the original Miss De Winter, and what actually might have happened there, and the relationship and the status of what went on there in the film. Did I miss anything, or is that's pretty much...
Nope, that's pretty much it. Throughout this film, we kind of get a sense that while it is at first appears to be a romance, when you look at it, it's actually more of a psychological thriller or even a horror. And part of that is that even though she does not make an appearance, our character of Rebecca truly haunts the halls of Manderley.
Mm-hmm. She does indeed, and we'll get into all of the ways that she does that. But like you bring up, I think genre and kind of classification of this film is actually one of the most interesting places to start, because everything branches out of that. Hitchcock's known for a lot of thrillers, but at the time, this was his first production in America. And David O. Selznick actually had just done Gone with the Wind, a very famous literary adaptation, and he wanted to do another one. So Gone with the Wind, which again is a very famous romantic film set in war times, etc., I think the expectation was that we were going to get something fairly similar in that way, and sort of like a period piece that has got the big house and all that kind of stuff, and has all the looks and trappings of a classic romantic. Older man finding love properly for the second time with younger woman. It seems to be all there, except we never really get a sense that, other than like a little sparkle in their eyes, they go, "Ooh, I find you quite attractive." You know, in both ways, I think that bit is reciprocated, that little sparkle. There is no real sparkle between them on screen, or very, very limited.
No.
So
I totally agree. And I think that's kind of what surprised audiences at the time and what
Mm-hmm.
continues to surprise us. As you said, it has all of the makings of a great romance story. It has the baseline of a rich, handsome man who is heartbroken and they meet, at the edge of a cliff and it's been destined to fade and they have this whirlwind romance and you think they're going into a happily ever after. But nothing could be further than the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where this turns from a potential romance into an actual horror.
Yeah. Do you think? And this strikes me at the time because I remember watching this for the first time and even thinking to myself, "My God, Laurence Olivier was a handsome man." And thinking much the
Yes,
same thing about Joan Fontaine going, she was incredibly beautiful, that kind of vulnerable way that she
absolutely.
played it. I wonder whether audiences the first time upon watching this in cinema were so bowled over by how beautiful that these two people were and that they sort of fell in love with them and the attractiveness that they forgot that it was a romance. They would have come out and still said, oh, this was a romantic thriller rather than a horror thriller or something. I definitely have the memory that it was much more stronger romantically than it was. And I think mainly just because my attraction to the main characters and the people that play it in rather than actually anything that they do.
Absolutely. Well, we can't forget that both of them were like an icon in Hollywood, especially Laurence
Mm.
Olivier. He was the it man of the time, and so he had, as you said, he had just done Gone with the Wind, where everybody loved Red. So I think audiences did go into that thinking, "Oh, we're going to get more of him," and
Mm.
I think that played into some of the complexity of the character overall, which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah. So starting with that, we'll start with Olivier's character himself, this Maxime de Winter, that we have. We'll go along and have him this kind of what seems to be a good catch. Rich is seemingly available, and as is alluded to, like our narrator's job at the start is to be a professional companion, actually, to another very rich woman. And this idea that this very rich woman is Van Hopper, or Von Hopper, whatever,
Mhm.
sees herself as a likely suitor for the Winter. They're staying in the same
She had
hotel, and
hopes. She
she
had
had
hopes
hopes,
and
and
dreams.
she keeps on telling. She tells a little story about how there was a man she ran into who avoided her, and he obviously was too dazzled by her beauty. Which,
Because that
I
was
mean, we've got
definitely
comedy in
it.
here.
Whatever you say, girlfriend.
Yeah, exactly right. So she has a very elevated idea and thought of herself, but this, I think, that is based in the fact that she considers herself of a similar class or a similar kind of
Right.
level in society than him, and doesn't see the young companion as a threat, regardless of her beauty. It doesn't even come into it.
I totally agree. And one of the great themes of this story is actually something about like class warfare and
Mm.
classicism. So as we see Mrs. Van Hopper, she actually says it out loud, like, I don't think you have the makings to be a great lady.
Lady,
And
yeah.
how much more insulting can you get to a woman who is just engaged to one of the richest men in their society? Um, so I definitely do agree that Mrs. Van Hopper definitely had a chip on her shoulders, and that's kind of where she got her confidence from. Albeit
Mm-hmm.
a little overly confident, but that's actually something we see in a lot of characters, and we see mirrored also in the character of Rebecca later. So it's kind of an interesting way to introduce this idea of kind of female empowerment, female confidence, but in a way that's a little bit overly and cartoonish, but it
Mm-hmm.
brings it through into the rest of the story through other characters. So I actually think that Mrs. Van Hopper played a really great role in setting the stage of what our nameless character was up against.
Yes, indeed, and again, how she was seen and how in society treated her, and then ultimately how Maxine treated her. So when they start their frivolous dating, again, my memory didn't show this to me, but Maxime's an incredibly controlling character at the start. Everything that she wants to do,
Yeah.
whether it's go tennis lessons, he takes the tennis racket and throws it away behind the bush and says, "No, we're doing this."
We're
Um,
going driving, get in the
we're
car.
going driving. Yes, I'm going to watch you paint and draw. Even her drawing, I mean, it's not great, but
Nah, nah. I don't think he married her for her drawing skills. I'm just saying
yeah,
that.
exactly
But
right. And like even up to the point when he does announce the engagement, and we can actually talk about the engagement itself because there's some symbolism, etc., within there. When Miss Van Hopper is presented with their engagement, and she actually plays her role within her class to say, well, in that case, my role is to be the matron and to be the mother person. I will look after and organise and look after this young woman in terms of,
and I'll give her away, and
I'll give her away and do all that kind of stuff.
She's inserting herself into this situation, which really doesn't concern her.
But it doesn't. But I do think that's what she sees as her role within the class of her place in society. You know, she's very much filling that role at that stage, and in some ways, I think makes certainly me soften to that character in some ways, because she is just a product of the system at the time. Like I genuinely believe she feels like that is the right thing to do. She is actually going to do it, even though she has no regard for this young woman whatsoever. I mean, she's almost the dirt underneath her shoe in a lot of ways, and she makes that very clear once it all kind of flips around with exactly the line that you pulled out. But that Maxim says, no, you're not. Nobody is to have any involvement with this young woman, or be the person that's going to vouch for her, or be the person that's going to stand for her, or otherwise. Which, again, I kind of got a chill when watching that, to kind of going like, that was just, no, she's a plaything, she's a trophy, she's literally an object to sit. She's mine, exactly right. Yeah.
I have to disagree a little bit. I see Mrs. Van Hopper's willingness to jump into that actually kind of relating to the theme of appearances in this story.
Okay.
So throughout Rebecca, we are led to think that appearances are everything, that what appears before us is the truth. And as we know later on, that's not necessarily true. And so for me, that interaction symbolically, when she was in front of Maxim saying, I'll give her away, I'll pay for everything, this will be like my show, even though she can't stand our main character, or can't stand her in the fact that she one-upped her, to her, she's keeping up appearances because of her status. If she was at the same level as our character in a socioeconomic sense, that wouldn't have happened at all. So, but what really solidifies that for me is the fact that she turned right away after Maxim left the room, and she insinuated some really, really terrible things about the engagement and what our narrator had done to get it, and she really turned on this person who she had paid to be a friend. So right. To me, that kind of is a theme of insincerity, and a theme of keeping up appearances and thinking things are one thing when they're actually wildly different. And we see that in the character of Rebecca herself. We see that in Manderley. We see that in Maxim even. Mm-hmm. So for me, this was kind of the introduction of that theme.
Yeah. And it also is the first occasion in this film, like, regardless of how Maxim's treating our narrator, the relationship between the two females is toxic from the very start. Like, yes. As cruel as Maxim is to our narrator, the relationship then between these two people, who are supposedly uncordial on professional terms, if nothing else, turns sour very quickly. There's a lot of scoffing and derision being pointed at our narrator's way. And this, regardless of how cruel the man is towards the female of on-female relationship is it's on another level. Like, it's another conversation that's happening there.
Absolutely. And that's also another theme that carries out into the rest of the story of Rebecca.
Yeah.
And I definitely agree that there is that element of feminine jealousy that, in Mrs. Hopper's mind, that, she's rich, she's at the top of their class, I think she's eligible, I'm not quite sure. That's the impression I got. And that she almost feels like entitled to somebody like Maxim because of their class structure. And the fact that somebody who she perceives as beneath her in a class or a socioeconomic status is something that drives jealousy.
Yeah. Even before we actually skip past that, I want to talk a little about the engagement scene in general. So the proposal. And the fact that she goes, yeah. So, and this is where I again, upon rewatch, I rewatched this twice, and the second time, so the third time I watched it. It feels like the whole thing, like, our narrator isn't innocent in this. She sought this out. She did not want to leave the hotel without speaking to him. She went up to his bedroom. She went up and says, I am leaving, just like leaving that hanging out there, even while being insecure. Like, there is an incredible symbolatry. It was actually pointed out on the commentary of, actually, as she realizes what's happening, the only thing in shot is the bed. right? There's a bed in the background. It's the only thing you can actually see in the shot of the bed. And as she realizes what's happening, she starts to back away from the bed, almost like symbolically saying,
Oh,
actually, I don't know if I'm ready for that, even though that's what I'm sort of proposing. And Olivier does the hand in his head, which is going to be a symbol for, oh dear, I can't handle what's about to happen here. I'm going to make a very rash, kind of incorrect judgment for myself. And then he panics and asks her to marry him at that stage. And the whole thing starts to devolve very, very quickly to the point that it is what she wants, but also I don't think it is what she wants. She's not ready for it, certainly emotionally, or you were talking about insecurity. She doesn't feel secure in herself enough to be the wife of a man like him. She wants to be in his company and being
right.
around him, certainly, but not in that level.
I totally agree. And that's also something that we see later in the film as well. And in fact, she struggles with it throughout the entire film.
Yeah,
And yeah, I actually hadn't noticed that before, but that is very interesting idea as well. I had noticed her backing away. So, yeah, it did, now that you say that, it did kind of struck me as a little weird that she just went into the bedroom of this gentleman at a hotel. Yeah, it doesn't look very, very innocent.
yeah,
And I think that's also where Mrs. Hopper got that idea that she's like, oh, you know what I mean? Is this where it happened? What are
yeah,
you doing here? Something that really bothered me though, and we'll talk a little bit about names and about how important they are and their meaning within the story, is that when he proposed to her, it almost felt a little bit like a joke, a little bit.
mm-hmm.
And then she perceived it as a joke, saying, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And I hated when he said, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool. And so they're right there, we're already seeing kind of her self-confidence chip away even within this romantic relationship, much less then followed by the awful confrontation from Mrs. Hopper. So we're kind of seeing that there's a lot of these external pressures and these external kind of judgments about our nameless narrator. Um, and because who asks someone to marry them and calling them a little fool? Like, who does that? That's the most unromantic thing I would say no to that. I don't care how rich he is, but I make him say it again. But yeah, but I thought that was kind of interesting is that we don't know the character's name. And I think one of the ways that somebody is addressing her is you little fool. And it's her
Yes.
husband. So I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, and then couple that with you're not make a great lady, all of that kind of stuff. There's nothing but derision and kind of saying what she isn't rather than what she is, including her name.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to
Even
that
the
point about
snide Mrs. De Winter, you know what I mean? And she's like very snide about like, oh yeah, you're Mrs. De Winter.
I had written that line down as well, as one that just kind of went, oh, okay. But like you say, the proposal itself and how it's said, there's no great gestures there. There's no romantic gesture. It's very much a fait accompli in some way. As I have decided that we are going to get married, therefore we will be married at that stage. And even taking
It
that,
almost felt like a business deal,
yeah.
a little bit. Like it almost felt like a business deal, which is kind of creepy.
Well, that leads on to actually the fact that he forgot to collect the marriage certificate. When they actually go to collect the marriage certificate, somebody throws it down off a balcony. It's literally a flimsy sheet of paper, and he throws it in his hat. Like, it's not shared to say with your partner to say, actually, this is it. It is very much like a business transaction. Here, can I have the receipt for that? We don't need the receipt. We'll just kind of throw that away somewhere. It definitely had that feel of it. And so from the outset, this never felt like a true partnership, if you know what I mean. And when we, especially when we examine our the reader's kind of character, that's exactly what she needed. She needed to be included and involved for any kind of future for herself or any kind of future involvement in the house.
I agree. I totally agree.
So we travelled to Mandalay, the house.
Beautiful Mandalay.
I was
That's
going to
right.
say, is this every young woman's dream? Is the house? Because actually, the most expressive face in the entire movie is Joan Fontaine's character when she sees the house. It is the face lengthens as her jaw opens, and she cannot believe what she's seeing. This is where I'm going to live.
Absolutely. Well, I think anybody would want to live in a castle. You know what I mean? And that's what it's like. It's very castle-like.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, like kind of the design of the house and how grand it is, and just the look of it, looks like something out of a fairy tale. And that's what I was kind of alluding to when I was saying that she thinks this is going to be a happily ever after. You know, this is
Hmm.
her Prince Charming. He's handsome, rich. Everybody wants him. She snagged him. And she's going to live in this big, beautiful mansion of a house. And this is where the happily ever after is supposed to start for her. But it doesn't. It is wildly different. So I think that's kind of the impression that we get when we first starting because there's something eerie about the house as well.
There is something here about the house, and I wonder if this was intentional. It's not actually a real house.
Yeah.
It's a model, and everything inside that we see is a set, and that everything, it's sort of a house built out of matchsticks in some ways, like again that kind of metaphor, or otherwise will kind of pay off in another way, but it has that sort of dreamlike quality of going up to it and seeing something that's actually larger than life, that couldn't exist in some life. They kind of made it a big model of it and used it for the location shots, and I think doing it that way does create this metaphor, both in terms of the filmmaking. Like Hitchcock was famous for the attention to detail about symbolism as much as anything else. And while
Mm.
he never alluded to the fact that this was never really a home, this was just a thing for show, especially for our narrator's character. I don't think that's an accident in any way.
You could also argue that it kind of does reflect Rebecca as a thing for show.
Indeed, indeed.
Mm.
Exactly.
Mm.
It being her house, essentially, even though she dies, it is a remnant or a husk of who she was and what's going. So that bit's very
Absolutely.
interesting. And of course, we get into the house, and we get the character of Mrs. Danvers. But the theme that I had for probably the next hour of the movie is, I wondered whether our narrator was more intimidated by the house or by Mrs. Danvers. Both incredibly intimidating, but actually, the character of the house and the character of Mrs. Danvers, I think she's equally intimidated by both.
I would agree. I think the fact that Mrs. Danvers took so much effort into preserving the house as Rebecca liked it kind of intricated both of them. So, in a way, the house is almost like Mrs. Danvers. It's not our protagonist's home. You know, this
That's
is a
right.
home of somebody else. This is someone who Mrs. Danvers serves. This isn't, she doesn't have her own lady's maid. She doesn't really belong. She doesn't know where the morning room is. They won't light the fire, you know, in the rooms that she wants to go to. She doesn't want to ask the staff to light a fire in her own house. And even just like the weird details like the placemats and the diaries and things like that. This isn't a place that she can move into and make her own because it's already occupied by the thought of Rebecca. Um, and in many ways, we can argue that Mrs. Danvers is exactly the same,
Hmm.
that Mrs. Danvers will not be a loyal member of the staff to our narrator because she is fully a loyal staff to Rebecca.
Yeah, it's almost like a hotel for our narrator. It's like you go into the hotel room, especially with like the personalized stationery and all that kind of stuff. It's like the stationery you get in the hotel where they're like it's branded with a hotel name on it. So this is Hotel Rebecca, in a lot of ways, and it's all kind of laid out for there. And even her duties that she's supposed to perform. This is where you will write your daily letters, and you can feel
Yeah, there was like
our narrator
no,
kind of going, who am I going to write to? What would that look like? That's not in her
yeah,
plan, but she's being told what she should do, even within the context of her day.
I know that was one thing that really irritated me is that the staff almost were instructing her how to act as the lady of the house
Indeed.
without it being like helpful. Because I do think some of them just thought it was helpful because this was what they knew for so long. Like the I think it was a butler or something. Like I liked the rapport that she had with the butler. Like I felt like the butler didn't have as much malice. It was just more this is how things are done day to day.
Yeah.
But what really bothered me was, you know, this whole idea of Mrs. De Winter would do this, and it's like, no, I am Mrs. De Winter. That doesn't matter
Mm,
anymore. No offense to Rebecca, but like, what does it matter if the lady of the house writes in the morning or the afternoon? You know what I mean? It's that
indeed.
really stringent and that control of keeping things the status quo that is so unhealthy. But I
Yeah.
think that when we talk later, that's not just necessarily how the house is run. That's the mindset of some of the people in the house as well.
But yes, I'll start going down that path because even very earlier on, we see what like there's a way that you can always see who's in control of a situation. You can see it in politics,
Mm.
you can see it in everything else. It's how people go through doors. Okay, so throughout, even the servants, um, they open the door for her to step through, and they let her go through first. Now, this is very classically a power struggle to basically say who ownership or who's in the more dominant position than anything. Miss Danvers does it first, but even some of the younger butlers do it with her as well. This idea that I'm going to make my way to the door, I'm going to leave. You don't have to leave, but I'm going to wait here until you leave, and then usher you out the door and close the door behind you. You know, it
Oh
is not,
yes,
that
yes.
happens continually in the first couple of scenes, which is in the house. And again, it's this idea that while this is her house and she's the new Mrs. De Winter, which she also, I think, tells the gardener on the phone, no, Mrs. De Winter died last year, even though it is her, but it's,
Yeah.
yeah, but this isn't her house. They actually servants room this house. It's not even so much Maxime's house. It's Rebecca's and the servants' house. That's whose abode this is.
I totally agree. One thing that also really bothered me was the fact that they just kept the stationery. Like, no offense, I don't mean to be insensitive, but Rebecca is never going to need her monogram stationery ever again. There's nobody named, there's no one that can use that. Okay, there is no one. That, okay, I get the clothes, I get the sheets, maybe, it might be a little weird, but I get that. But no one is going to use that stationery ever again. That can go in the trash after a
Unless her
year.
name is
And
Rochelle or Rachel or Rihanna. Maybe she's Rihanna. That's who she is.
but even so, like on one, I think on one of the frames, it had it like uh, Rebecca De Winter, and I think it was printed on top, so it was
It
like a
was. It was.
monogrammed thing. So, but I'm just like, this literally no one's going to use this. Nobody in the world is going to use this. Doesn't matter. And just the fact that they kept it there when they knew that a new Mrs. De Winter was coming in, made me cringe. It made me so uncomfortable
But
personally.
it's been there for a year. This woman's been dead for a full year, and nobody, like, the house has obviously been kept in very good repair. It's been kept very well, but they obviously were lighting that fire in that room every day, even though she wasn't. Nobody was there. You know, as a form of, ritual or something, and then the stationery is put
Yeah,
out. So again, it's this idea that while Rebecca is dead, she's not the routines, and her life is still existing within the people in the house that are there.
I totally agree. But it's just that really bothered me because you can argue everything else. You know, you can argue the clothes. Yes, they were very pretty. You can
Mm-hmm.
argue, maybe even like the linen, fine, whatever. But the fact that the stationery was there and it was such a contention with our
Yeah,
character, it just, that's the kind of our first clue that something isn't normal in this house.
we talk a lot in the previous ones about things like color, and obviously there is no color in Rebecca because it's a black and white film. So you're only then left with a couple of things that kind of relate to that. They use lighting quite a lot, and I'll talk a bit about the filmmaking and the
Mm.
lighting because I think some of the things they did were phenomenally clever. But it also leads into the idea that costume, etc., plays such a prominent part in identifying our characters. It's also plays a prominent part in the plot of the story, as it turns out, much later on as Miss Danvers goes. But what were your thoughts on the costume and as being the expert and somebody that wears black t-shirts and tracky bottoms most day?
Well, I have to say, costuming is probably one of the most important aspects in this film. As you mentioned, this film is totally in black and white. And so, where Hitchcock usually used color to convey something to the audience, and we talked about that a little bit in films like Vertigo,
Vertigo.
he
Yeah.
couldn't do that in these films. But what he could do is play with light and costuming.
Mm.
And when I was looking at this, I really noticed that at the beginning, the protagonist wore a lot of white. And in fact, she wore a lot of light colors that actually blended into the background a little bit. So, and with the styling of her hair and her coloration and just kind of her overall look, she didn't stand out in the film. And I think that was stylistically very important because it internally said that she was not comfortable in this environment. She was mousy.
Yeah.
She was part of the woodwork. She could not stand on her own 2 feet in comparison to this idea of Rebecca that she had. So I thought it was kind of interesting that when we see her, yes, she wears some like darker clothes, but she's never in like a solid black
Mm-hmm.
until she puts on the evening gown. And I thought that was just so interesting because her style is very kind of like this good girl, almost teachery type of like
Yes.
very modest type of thing, all buttoned up. She never had like, anything showing. Um, but when she thinks that Rebecca is what Maxim wants, she goes out and buys a dress that she's totally uncomfortable with. And it's a great dress,
Yeah.
but the dress wears her. She does not actually
Yes.
wear the dress. And I thought what was really interesting is that even though the dress was pitch black and it was the first time we're seeing her in an all black attire, it still has detailing of white. So to me, it's saying like, even though I'm kind of playing dress up, I am creating this persona that I want to emulate to please my husband. On the inside, she's still not secure in it. She still
Yeah.
has that stark whiteness that's kind of blending into her background and kind of showing that she's not altogether consumed by this. Until later in the story, when she does wear all black. And do you know when that is?
Don't the
It's after she realizes the truth about Rebecca and Max.
Rebecca's. Yeah.
So, yep. So, and that's kind of very important because then right afterwards, she transforms in front of the camera. She's wearing these smart suits with these hats, and she's starting to really look like the image that someone would have of a Mrs. De Winter. She's almost kind of looking like a Rebecca. And I think a Rebecca-like character, not actually Rebecca, but I think the importance about this transformation, because when you look for it, it's very, very obvious then, is that she's going from somebody who's not very sure of herself, who's kind of mousy, who doesn't want to get in anybody's way, into now she has information that empowers her and who kind of dispels this myth and this ideology of Rebecca. And now she's becoming the strong woman to be in a relationship fully with Maxim and take charge of the house. So I thought that was really interesting because again, we can't use color. So the only thing that we could use in this film is style and the shading within the outfits. And I thought that was incredibly cool that Hitchcock did.
Yeah, I had her, especially when she moved into the house. These very, very pretty but unflattering, like blouses and things that she used to wear. These kind of patterned dresses that kind of really reinforced the idea that she was a little girl within the context of this house. And a bit like you're saying, I hadn't noticed exactly the point, but again, it's that idea. She's intimidated by everything at a certain point of the story. And then when she realizes that actually the stories that she's been fed or the impressions she's been given of this superwoman actually was flawed, it gives her a place to come in and say, well, I could be whatever I want to be now. I don't have to, I am not matching up to some ideal with this man. 'Cause I don't think she really, she doesn't care about the house. She doesn't care about impressing Mrs. Danvers to a certain degree. She just wants Mrs. Danvers just to accept her. She doesn't want her to love her. She just wants her to accept her and sort of leave her alone. But I think she would like to have that place in Maxim's life, even though there's not much going on there, so to speak. But she is committed to that being her future, and therefore she can take ownership of it then and be the person that she wants to be and actually being given a place or a role within the house at that stage that she hasn't from beforehand.
I totally agree. And in fact, she then becomes Mrs. De Winter. She becomes the Mrs. De Winter that she embodies, not necessarily the one
Yeah.
that Rebecca has. And I think it's also interesting is that when you look at the other characters around, they're all kind of have like a darker costuming look. So they're nothing, no one's as like light and bright as she
That's
is
right.
in her style. So like the rich woman, she was dressed in all black in the confrontation. Maxim has darker suits. Even the cousin, I think his name is Favel, he has like a darker tie. So like he has a little bit of a mix of something that stands out. And of course, we have Mrs. Danvers, who's dressed head to toe in a black garb.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because in my brain, that kind of symbolizes like the people, the influence that Rebecca had. So when you, because all of these people, when they're wearing dark, they know the truth in some
Mm-hmm.
regard. Like maybe not the rich lady, but they know of Rebecca and they know definitely the truth about Rebecca in some cases. And so when she then learns the truth, that's when she starts to wear the darker colors as well So not only does it symbolize that she's becoming her own person, her own woman, and a leader of a household, but now that Rebecca's impacted her, but not held power over her anymore. So I think that was kind of interesting too when you looked at kind of all of the characters together and what they were wearing.
And just to reinforce your point, it's that idea that as people get more comfortable with who they are and the role and etc., they take on this kind of different wardrobe and they're presented in it. I sort of feel like a lot of those other characters, whether it's Maxim's sister, the cousin, etc.,
Mm.
they all are one archetype, if you know what I mean. I think I talked about this a little bit before when we were trying to identify character names. They sort of all become the same person to a certain point in sort of not being able to stand out. Like nobody has an individual dress sense. Nobody has
No.
anything going for them. And especially in the case of Miss Danvers, that all black, she's very much like a statue for a lot of it. This imposing figure. The
Yes.
black actually gives her a presence that is unshakable. You combine that with the fact of how she's filmed and she's represented. Like she never walks into frame aside from the very first time we see her a little bit, but every other time she just appears like a ghost or an apparition.
Yeah.
Like she's always watching you.
Right behind you.
Yeah, all the time, and has this sort of inappropriate closeness at a certain points when she does appear then in the frame. And it's like, oh my god, she's almost like the boogeyman in some ways, and she
Yeah.
definitely gives that away. Again, reinforcing the idea that this is a horror movie, really.
Exactly, exactly. And I think also one scene that really stood out to me was the fact when she wore that beautiful white dress in the costume party and everybody freaked out.
Yeah.
And so, and then right after we have that confrontation with Danvers, and you see the stark, like black and white, you see the black cloth of Mrs. Danvers, and you see this pure white ensemble. And then very quickly after, she turns into a more darker wardrobe. So I think that was really interesting. That was like her last moment of holding on to this kind of mousy, like sit in the corner. Like that was the last time that somebody else was going to dictate what she was going to do, and it blew up in her face. But I think costuming wise, that's what Hitchcock was signaling to the audiences.
Mm. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the Danvers narrator relationship in some ways,
Yes.
because it's obviously pretty much the key relationship, actually, regardless of the marriage or otherwise. It's the key relationship within the entire film, I think, of certainly from a visual sense that we have. Obviously, there's the relationship between Danvers and Rebecca in the background. It's always sort of referred to, and we'll come to that probably in a little bit. But the one that we actually see in the screen is this one of the disapproving mother or otherwise. And it's been alluded to that this is the Cinderella story, in that our narrator is Cinderella and Mrs. Danvers is one of the ugly sisters. In some ways, they keep her locked away in the tower to kind of do her bits, write her letters, maybe, so to speak. And yet the public face and the disapproving face is always Mrs. Danvers. And regardless of what she does, she'll never win her approval, if that makes sense. She doesn't see her on the level of the person that she's
Right.
supposed to be aspires to be, which is probably Rebecca, is what we're thinking as the viewer.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree.
Um, what what do you think? Like, obviously, the casting of Miss Danvers was very very key in doing it and doing that, and obviously, then in the same way, Joan Fontaine's character, the casting of that is. I think the whole movie rests actually in what they did with that, because seeing the options had, and I'll talk about that some later, would have went along the other way. What do you think of their central relationship as being this horror relationship? If we're going to call it a horror movie,
Mhm.
what is it about the relationship? Do you think that really scares or creates that bit? Do you ever feel threatened to the point of like she's going to kill her or be responsible for killing her or lead her into a place where she will end up killing herself or something? Is it that threatened? Because usually horror films have that kind of existential threat to somebody's existence at the core of it.
Mm.
Is it that, or is it a little bit more subtle, do you think?
I think it's a little bit more subtle. I saw it more that Mrs. Danvers wanted to destroy our narrator from the inside out rather
Okay.
than, actually create harm, because I don't think Mrs. Danvers, I don't get the impression that she would throw somebody off a building, but I think she would emotionally manipulate somebody to jump. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this, it's almost like a very, very extreme form of bullying.
Yeah.
and harassment, but done in a really, really like psychologically damaging and underhanded way. So I do see that that would be more of her motive, and that's probably because she's a person that does live in the shadows in this house. You know what I mean? Like she
Yes.
is, she's not the lady of the house. She is not front and center. She's an orchestrator, and she has to orchestrate the house. So it would make a lot of sense that she would also orchestrate somebody's internal turmoil, especially someone that she saw as less than or weaker than her, such as our narrator, in order to make them destroy themselves from the inside out rather than her actively doing it. So that's kind of the impression that I get from Mrs. Danvers.
And so, leading on from that, obviously there's a lot of mileage that goes in between. When we reach the end of the film, then, and uh, Miss Danvers burns the house down around her, is that a representation of the truths that she's been come to, but also tainted by the fact that the relationship between our narrator and her is actually inextricably changed in terms of power dynamics and in terms of who owns the house, and she actually can't accept that? Or is it just locked up in the revelations about Rebecca and how she's seen that character, etc.? It becomes very complex at that stage and leaves sort of this open ending of how to interpret it.
See, I actually interpreted it the way that you mentioned, that it's more of her coming to terms that this was the reality versus whatever type of preserving she was trying to do throughout the house. One of the great things about this film is that from the outside, if you think of it as a romance and then you also think about it as a thriller, a lot of people, I think, kind of go into it thinking that Maxim's the villain. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, there's difference in the books and in the film, but we're going to stick to the film for this. And so I think that a lot of people would presume that Maxon's the villain, but the real villain is Mrs. Danvers. And in fact, she, as I said, she's orchestrating a lot of things within the story. She's orchestrating kind of, I mean, who's going to hang on to these stationery? It's Mrs. Danvers. No
Yeah.
one else is going to dare to throw out something without Mrs. Danvers' approval. And I do think there are other undertones with Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca that would lead us to think that the fire is kind of Mrs. Danvers' shock into reality, that she's almost in a despair in and of herself with all the changes, with all the fact that she can't control things anymore, and the fact that Rebecca is in fact gone. And
Yeah.
she may not have known everything about Rebecca. So I personally think that she would rather burn down the house rather than admit that some things were not true.
Yeah, I sort of see it, and this is certainly in retrospect. I don't think you get this during the watch. Is very much again her wearing her black. She's been grieving the death of,
Yes,
Rebecca for a long while, and the person that she is grieving is actually not the person at the end of the movie that she thought it was at the start, and therefore the only way that she can deal with it is actually to take away the remnants of Rebecca at that stage, which includes the house, which is Manderley as it goes. It has to go, and in sort of a way, it consumes her as well, because that hate and that grief kind of consumes her at the end, and kind of the two become this hand in hand relationship. You can't have one without the other one. Mrs. Danvers is inextricably linked to the house, and the house is inextricably linked with Rebecca, and therefore, if we're to have any future, or anybody's to have any sort of future or anything to happen, they all need to go. They all need to go in one fireball, so to speak.
exactly, exactly. And you can also think of that. It's also about Mrs. Danvers' internal heartbreak in realizing that Rebecca is gone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because throughout, like, we get a lot of context early on with kind of a plot twist at the end. And I think if you think about her character and how much she devoted to Rebecca, knowing, having that revelation and like realizing, as you said, the person she's mourning isn't the person she thought she knew, that is mind blowing for somebody like Mrs. Danvers, because she is dedicating everything to Rebecca.
Sure.
And especially there's a line where I think it was Mr. Fable said, "Oh, she pulled one over you and me. This is like what happened." And I think that's kind of what tipped uh, Mrs. Danvers kind of over the edge, because she's been hanging on to this for dear life for a long time. And kind of that one piece of information that she feels maybe she was tricked or manipulated by Rebecca in some ways. That's kind of was like, oh, how could that happen? Like I'm a plotter, I'm a manipulator. How could somebody be manipulating me? And that's what causes the internal turmoil for her that she can't handle and causes everything to go up in flames. It's a destruction of herself.
And on that, obviously, again, I missed this the first time I seen it. It is definitely alluded to that there was a relationship between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca that predates even probably the marriage in some ways, given
Mm-hmm.
the plot lines of the story. And my question is this: so she obviously had a lot of affairs, Rebecca, when she was alive, like, but her male ones were constituted outside of the house in the beach house. And
Yeah,
obviously, I think it's sort of intimated then that the relationship between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca that continued on after she married happened just in the house, and the two things were kept separate in that way. And again, it's that symbolism of who she was in the house and who she was outside of the house. I think in the house, Miss Danvers would have assumed that Rebecca's was hers, and then
I
couldn't
agree.
accept the
I
fact
think that's a
that
great
outside of
point.
it, yeah,
Yeah. And that not only had Rebecca fooled her, but then she fooled another lover. And
yeah,
I think that's kind of when, when you realize that you've been lied to, or like you feel like the person that made you feel special didn't really like made other people feel special too. That's a heartbreaking situation. And
yeah.
it psychologically does do a lot of damage to a person. So I think that that's kind of where the motivation to fire up everything went to. And I also picked up, this is also something that eluded me on my first like read and my first viewing, but then this last one I picked up on it as well. We kind of get the sense that her and Mrs. Danvers were extremely close, more close than probably somebody who just works in the house, because there's a lot of undertones of sensuality when it comes to like Mrs. Danvers' description of her clothing or what she wore or her nightly rituals or her bath or like there's a lot of sense of like physical closeness as well with the hair
Yes.
brushing and she's keeping her negligee out like again this is something that could be put away in a year so yeah that's kind of where you see that Mrs. Danvers had a lot more invested in Rebecca than probably the narrator saw and probably that the audience saw like maybe at the time, but when you look at it you can see the motivations on why Mrs. Danvers was doing all of these things.
And how everybody kind of grieves the relationship, because obviously I think for the other men that Rebecca was seeing, I mean, they obviously knew she was married to Maxim, right? So actually when it turned out that, I don't think they held her, or the grief was as strong, because it was a dalliance for them. They knew that they were never
Yeah,
the big picture, whereas I think Mrs. Danvers did. But then conversely for Maxim
yeah,
himself, this kind of idea, and this is where the book and the film obviously very differ, is the fact that his wasn't grief, his was guilt, rather than
yeah,
he was mourning Rebecca. So actually by the end of the film, he's been released of the guilt without ever having any of the grieving process. We don't really feel anything for Maximum in that stage. Like, we never consider his grief for the fact we think that's what it is at the start of the film, absolutely. But the film's revelations about what happens in identifying wrong bodies and then trying to obfuscate what happened in the event of her death, etc., gets revealed. But when Maxim is free almost to have a true love at the end of this, like, there is a possible future for him at the end with our narrator, to start now, even though there hasn't really been any sense of it.
absolutely. And in that way, he's free now,
Yeah,
whereas I don't think Mrs. Danvers would have been.
yeah. She was
I,
she was horrified by the whole thing, and again, in some ways, it was the only end that she could have for herself. I think, in a lot of ways, was to do what she did at the very end of it. I'd like to talk a little bit about the casting of Joan Fontaine, right?
ooh,
Because
yes,
when
the
I was
cast is
doing my
very
exploration
interesting.
of this, I found this completely fascinating. There are complete casting notes for when they interviewed people. They 20, 30, 40 women they seen for this, and they recorded a lot of the casting sessions in costume, out of costume, with Olivier, with other characters, reading, etc. And there were a lot of very prominent names that they wanted for it. It was originally thought at the very start that Carol Lombard would do it, from the very start, and that didn't. That was who says that kind of bought the script for at the time, the producer. But then it came down to a couple of people. Now, Olivier was in a relationship with Vivian Leigh at the time. Okay, and he was very much
Mhm.
strongly recommending that Vivian Leigh. But the casting notes of it, and I can actually see this between Selznick and Hitchcock, they were horrified at the idea that Vivian Leigh would be playing this character. Absolutely horrified. They openly scoff it and write it down in the production notes about what a disaster it would have been for the entire film if Vivian Leigh had been cast, and that she is not the right fit. She is just not the character that they want. Now, I've seen her screen test. I sort of know what they mean insofar as she's too confident for the role. If you know what I mean, she can't help but project a confidence with her. And I think actually her being in a relationship with Olivier would have only made that worse. If you know what I mean, there would have been a comfort level there that you couldn't undo.
Yeah, when I picture her, I actually think she would embody more Rebecca than she would the Miranda. Like I
Yes,
think if they had to cast somebody as Rebecca, she would be the perfect pick, absolutely,
that
because she does
that would have
have
been a
that
great
kind of
pick.
like she does have a little bit of a sensuality about her as well, which
She
is why
does.
she and Olivia got along so well, and as well as that like confidence. And I mean, she just did Scarlett O'Hara, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
the some of those scenes are extremely confident. So in my mind, I could see her if they had a personification of Rebecca doing really well in that role. But I do think that the what was the actress's name? Miss Fontaine, I think.
But yeah, Joan Fontaine,
The
yeah.
Joan
Who was
Fontaine.
cast.
I do think, yeah, I do think Joan Fontaine really embodied like kind of this deer in headlights look that was necessary for the narrator character.
Yeah, so the other two that were in serious consideration were Margaret Sullivan, who they just said was just came
Mm.
across a bit too mature and old, and then Anne Baxter, who was the other way. I think Anne Baxter would have been a really interesting person. She comes across as very young, but almost I think if she'd have been cast in it, I think it'd have been really interesting taking it. But I think we as the viewer would have seen ourselves as the parent to her. I think we would have felt an awful lot
Yeah.
more. Whereas Joan Fontaine, I think certainly I had the feeling like she sort of knows what she's getting into. She's not totally naive, but she is. You know, we
Yeah.
don't actually worry for her so much because it's kind of on her. Whereas I think Anne Baxter, we would have just went, "Oh my god, it's terrible. What's happening to her?" But
Yep.
interestingly,
Exactly.
the other person who they really would have liked for this is Joan Fontaine's sister. Do you know who Joan
Ooh,
Fontaine's
that's
sister
interesting.
is?
I didn't know that.
Her
No.
estranged sister. They never spoke throughout their entire life. Olivia de Havilland is her sister, and they never got on at all. And they ruled de Havilland out because she was signed to Warner at the time, and actually dealing with Warner would have been impossible in terms of getting her released. But they kind
Mm.
of went Olivia de Havilland actually would have been the person that they would have cast in this outside of. And the only person that went to bat for Joan Fontaine was she was the compromise character was Selznick's wife. And she was the
Oh
person that she was the
goodness.
only person out of every time the scene and the cast and all that kind of stuff. Um, that she was the only person, and even when the film started, because Vivian Leigh didn't get the role, Olivier was, let's say, a
That's right.
dick to Fontaine the whole way through the whole film. He took
Yeah.
umbrage at the fact that she wasn't cast and he wasn't allowed to star with his then partner, and made it very
Yeah.
very difficult. I've seen some interviews with Fontaine, and she went, "It was just awkward for a few days." He says, "No." He was an ass about it for the entire film
Yeah.
of it, which comes across, I think, in some ways, but also sort of is what they
Yes.
wanted out of it. I think they wanted some sort of like veneer of non-connection between the two, because again, I think it would have been a very different film without it.
I definitely agree too, because if they had to like that comfort and familiarity that he would have had with I don't say Scarlett O'Hara, but you know the
Yes,
actress who
yes,
plays Scarlett O'Hara, we wouldn't get that is it him type of thing.
yes.
Like we couldn't because that's kind of what also drives this plot is that when we don't know what's going on, and again I said like we would assume that would be like the husband that would be the villain. And I think that with this casting and with that hostility, that actually did shine through a little bit. So in a weird, totally unnecessary way, it actually worked out very well for the dynamics between the characters because
I
we
agree.
did kind of get this aloofness and this kind of guardedness. And we, as the audience, can say it's because of Rebecca, but really it's that Laurence Olivier was not happy.
Yeah,
so,
and it's another
so it worked
example. Like
out.
we've talked about the birds, we've talked actually about Vertigo, about how key casting was, especially for Hitchcock himself. He was so obsessed with getting his casting right as being the one bit he could never undo once it started or otherwise, that it became such a major thing throughout his entire career of highlighting people for future projects, for highlighting, that as he got more involved and got more successful throughout his career. This being, of course, the
I
only
totally
film of
agree.
his that won Best Picture at the Oscars,
Excuse me. I didn't
which,
know that.
yeah, it's the only one, except he doesn't think so. He says, I've
Don't
never
say
won an
that.
Oscar. He said David O. Selznick won the Oscar for it. He went up the stage and he
Yeah.
corrected it. The best director that year was John Ford for Grapes of Wrath in 1941, so he says he never won one. He's very, very quick to point out that he never won an Oscar and was never given an Oscar. And I think it's a real shame because I sort of feel like Rebecca casts a shadow on the rest of his career in some ways because of
Yeah.
a bit like The House, a bit like Rebecca. It sort of casts that long shadow of the rest of his career in terms of he couldn't feel comfortable in that house. I think Rebecca is a magnificent film, a magnificent story, but how it's told and all of that kind of stuff is just such an impactful film.
I completely agree. And I didn't know that. That was very interesting. I would have thought
Yeah,
that, yeah, that's pretty interesting.
yeah. So, anything else that really comes up throughout it all? The other
Um,
thing I'll talk about is the fact that actually, but this being Hitchcock's first US film, he actually says about had it been later in his career, he would have insisted that they make this in England. He
really?
feels that it would have been a much better. Well, I mean, it was a very English cast anyway. You had Olivier,
Yeah.
even Joan Fontaine is British at heart. She considered herself British, even though she was British American, born in Tokyo, as it turns out. There's a very strong British element to it. Um, Throughout it, he kind of thinks that he would have shot it in England later in his career, because it originally was an English novel. It was set in England, I believe, the original novel, as is the Birds, I think, as well as originally set in England. So I think
I
it's
can see
funny to
that.
think of the Birds set in England. Like it seems such a
Yeah,
quintessentially
it's
kind of
very different.
American, yeah, idea. And similarly here, I, I wonder what would have been different about it, or what it would have investigated in him, or when he looks at it and he goes, there's something about that I don't like.
Yeah, that's
Interesting.
interesting. Yeah, yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but I would agree with that. I didn't realize how much, you know, that would actually fit, but that's true. And who knows? Have you seen the remake by any chance of
The what?
Rebecca?
Sorry.
The remake of Rebecca?
Oh no, I haven't. No, I
There's a
didn't
new
watch it.
one. No,
Yeah,
neither
from
did I.
2020.
Neither have I.
I heard some
Yeah,
monstrosity. Every time I Googled it, I went, this monstrosity, the monstrosity that should never have been made, kind of thing. Okay, I don't need to say it then.
yeah, I didn't see it either. So, one more thing I wanted to talk about is that this is actually a lot centered on kind of this idea of uh, feminine jealousy type of
Yes.
idea. So as we said, like with Mrs. Van Hopper, we already set the stage that there's jealousy of a richer lady to a poorer lady because of her marriage and her status. But that actually then goes further, and we see that not only is our narrator then jealous of kind of like this house and like everybody else that like kind of has this rhythm to living in this house, but she's also wildly jealous of Rebecca. And I think that's so interesting is that she's never met Rebecca. She only has an idea of who Rebecca was and what she kind of stood for in her personality. And for some reason, granted, she was being like shoved down her throat at every turn, and they really should have just thrown out the papers there. To be honest, just throw out the stationery. But even so, is that she kind of allows Rebecca to take this real estate up in her head as well. If she had come in and said, "Let's get rid of the stationery," like she could have probably changed this narrative. But the fact that she is, in fact, jealous of Rebecca, not only for what the house stood for and the clothes, but the fact that she had a relationship with Maxim, I thought was really poignant. And then
Yeah.
we apply that, and then we can apply the jealousy that Mrs. Danvers had probably towards Maxim. And then actually, I do think she was jealous of our narrator as well, and that's why she caused a lot of
Yeah.
issues for her because she's seeing the world move on from Rebecca, where she is still grieving, and she's seeing that this is like a replacement. And so I think that this idea of like female jealousy and kind of women hating other women for their perceived slights and their perceived like other type of attributions is a very very interesting thing to explore in this film because it's so prevalent everywhere. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and that was something else that I observed in the movie.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it comes out in this idea. I get it from my own kids as well. Everybody wants to be something that they aren't. If you know what I mean. When you're young, you want to be an adult. You kind of say, "If only I was an adult, I'd be that." When you're older, you just want to be younger. And even to your narrator's character, it comes to the point. She says, "I wish I was 36. I wish I was covered in pearls. I wish I was all these things." And Maxim pats her down and says, "Well, then I wouldn't be interested in you." Basically, it's a very, I know I've talked about that line before already, but it is very, very much cutting about the way people perceive themselves, and actually what people want out of them at any given stage, and yet they can't help themselves. That idea that she is jealous of Rebecca. If I only had her grace, and again, for somebody that you've never met, I think that's such a strange emotion to have. Like, you could never conquer that. If you can never put a name on it, you can never tangibly see it. And it's only when Rebecca is shown to have faults that the room for her to grow is given.
Exactly.
And the jealousy is taken away from her in some ways.
Exactly.
And interestingly, there doesn't seem to be the jealousy amongst the male characters, even though there was those relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Which is really very funny.
The male affairs definitely seem much more transactional than emotional in some ways. And again, probably worth mentioning that the relationship with the cousin, was that okay in 1938? Was that fine?
I don't know. That one threw me for a loop there too. Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, and the sad thing is, like, I feel like Rebecca could pick other people. I don't think this is like a small town type of thing. I think she had options. At least it sounded like she had options. Yeah, so that was something that also, but I think that kind of delves into kind of like the scandalousness of Rebecca. And I hate to say it, but I do think Rebecca's sensuality and her sense of her own sexuality actually was seen as something that was very bad. And like as we talked about with the character being very like our main character being buttoned up and she wore white and she wears this very like demure, almost virginal in a way, if you even want to say that. Like she's very like that type of innocence about her. And then we see like Rebecca's clothes, and they are not that way in any sense of regard. But knowing that like she had a relationship with her own cousin kind of pushes it over the edge, where we're like, oh my gosh, this is probably why she was seen as problematic with Maxim, much less all the other drama and all the other plot twists that we see. But I think that it just kind of served of how far she was going with her own like drives and her own sense of self and her own choices. And I think that's what ultimately made her problematic, is that she was this almost overly empowered woman, and she didn't fit this objectification that was to be serving as Max's wife. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I think it was a little bit of a shock factor. I think it was just kind of used as, this is what Rebecca was actually doing, and this is it gives people like the ick, and that kind of peels away at this perfect idea that we have of Rebecca.
I wonder actually in retrospect whether it was, again, something you brought up earlier, is this class system. It happens quite a lot in higher class societies, this kind of almost incestuous kind of inbreeding kind of thing. Like the royal family is just famous, and Britain is famous for third cousins, fourth cousins, etc., being the wives, etc. Everybody has to know somebody, and that kind of circle will not expand outwards. It doesn't expand out into the common people, pretty much. So it just kind of creates this idea that is the pool with which you're kind of searching within for that. So I wonder if it was a commentary on that, or whether it was just because it was the war. We need to make more people. We need to make more babies.
I don't know. You'd have to ask Rebecca. I'm out of my element on this one.
I can ask Daphne Du Maurier about that one, but what she was thinking about that. But that is, I think that is an interesting point that comes out in the film. So actually, of the three films I've seen, like, they're not bad. Vertigo, The Birds, Rebecca. Go 1, 2, 3 for me so far.
I have to go with Vertigo's number one because
Okay.
I do really like that one. I think significantly it has a little bit more value than Rebecca does. Um, Definitely Rebecca is a very close second for all the reasons we've discussed today,
Hmm.
and then it's gonna be the birds.
Okay.
The birds. How
I
about you,
have
James?
I have the birds as number three as well. Like it's not. I actually was surprised how much when I really sat down and watched the birds and tried to pick it apart like we've been doing. It's amazing how much my appreciation for just lots of things go way up when you do that, and it's sort of like
Yeah.
it's what makes these conversations so much fun, but also sort of a bit intimidating. Sometimes do you kind of go, oh my god, I need to bring my A game. What have we got, etc. Here, but I would actually put Rebecca and Vertigo the other way around. I think Rebecca is
Oh,
possibly my favorite Hitchcock on a certain
ooh.
day. I sort of like gothic
On a certain
set
day.
dramas anyway. That kind of definitely has that Dragonwyck feel, which is a Vincent Price kind of film with Gene Tierney, isn't it? Etc. That kind of big mansion house, the big rich man and the kind of quiet, understated lady kind of going into that. That is a even though I'm not a massive fan of period dramas, that is a trope that I actually quite enjoy,
Mm.
especially in films. In terms, so I would have Rebecca then Vertigo, but like not bad three films, like I have to say in general.
No, not bad. I mean, they've all been great conversations. So you do
Mm-hmm.
anyone who hasn't seen those other two, you got to go check them out. But I actually, the reason why I put Vertigo over this is because I think the character complexity of the main character
Yes.
um, is a little bit higher quality than our main character in Rebecca. So that's
Yeah.
what kind of pushes it over the edge for me. And of course, we
Completely
talked
fair.
about the Jimmy Stewart's character and like that type of like almost madness. So I do think they're very similar films in a kind of a strange way, but
Yes.
they're just done in a little bit different way. So for me, I like darker characters. I like creepier things. I like kind of messed up dynamics. So I do have to put Vertigo just a hairs above Rebecca,
Mm.
but it's very
I can definitely
close.
see that the Kim Novak character compared to Joan Fontaine's character is isn't much of a comparison in terms of leading in the narrative because Kim Novak's character totally does lead the narrative there. You kind of follow her,
Yeah.
and there's nothing better than a is she a wrongin? Is she not a wrongin? There's nothing. There's nothing better than that as a sense of going forward. So we'll have to have a conversation and pick what we're going to do next. I have some
That'll be
ideas
the
of where
great
I would like
finale.
to go
Yeah.
next. Yeah, especially
Yeah.
one that kind of we went from a film that isn't a romance, more of a horror thriller. I don't know. We're coming Valentine's Day's in a couple of days. If it's we're recording this, I don't know. We could try and find one, but we'll see what we come up. We've had some suggestions, which is great. The likes of Josh, etc., was in the comments last time, saying we should do this one or that one, which is very much appreciated about that. We're trying to think of things. I think that around times of the year I think
Yes.
would like to do that and kind of theme it. Even though there's not very many of those like that, a lot of them are go across seasons or otherwise, or seasons don't come into it. But if we could do it, that would be interesting.
I actually do think Rebecca was probably a good pick for Valentine's Day. I mean, because
Yeah,
we did say it's kind of like this gothic horror
romance. Yeah,
romance type of thing. Is at the end of the day, it's all about kind of like these love triangles and this like spite and all that. So, what else screams Valentine's Day than that?
indeed. It, and spending a lot of money, being fascinated by money and riches and Valentine's Day, but there not actually being much to it after that effect. It's pretty much an allegory
There you
for this
go.
film.
Good one,
Brilliant.
Chris.
Thank you so much, Jane. Where would people find you if they wanted to find more of your fantastic insights and opinions on what you've been reading, etc.? Because you're back on the reading train and you've been pumping out a good bit of content recently. So yay!
Thank you. Yay, thank you so much. I am Jane from Lady Jane Books. I am available on BookTube under Lady Jane Books, and I also have an Instagram at Lady Jane Books. I read kind of more spooky, horror, creepy stories, and feel free to follow me on any of those platforms.
Yeah, I'll put the links down in the description again as I always do, and I can't wait to the next conversation already. Thank you very
I'm
much.
excited.
Speak to you all soon. Take care.